beep, 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 beep. How are we doing, peeps? Welcome to the court of the Edijester once again. As here today, we have the scribblings of the marvellous and ever floral Helen Joyce. Helen here, taking a close look at what she's calling the 5 stages of victory, which is a handy guide to tracking how gender ideologues are coping. Now, before we begin, subscribe, like usual, share, coffee, come be a war teacher. Listen. It is more than half a century, says Helen, since the psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she was funny, she was, a bit of a Fruit Loop. She believed in all sorts of things, spirit guides. And she came up with this, 5 stages of grief. Is what has become known as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. After the Supreme Court ruling that men who claim to be women don't count as women for the purpose of equality at all, it offers a handy way to track how gender ideologues are coping. Oh, Helen, it's interesting because we cover this in the seminars, this nonsense grief model, right, which has been completely obliterated in terms of what it was actually about originally. So far, most are bouncing uncomprehendingly, says Helen, between the first 2 stages, with no sign they understand that their loss may prove fatal. Presumably because it barely registered as a possibility beforehand. 3 hours before the judgment was handed down, John Molan, fox basher and wearer thereof of kimonos, originally a tax barrister, then an anti-Brexit campaigner, and now an evangelist for chemical castration of minors with puberty blockers, posted on Blue Sky that his side would win because the law was really pretty clear. Strangely, in light of the Supreme Court agreeing to hear the case, every lawyer Joe Mo knew apparently said it wasn't even arguable. And then we launch with Helen here into the different stages. Here's stage 1. Denial is led by the barrack room lawyers of X and Blue Sky, who are merrily churning out legally illiterate hot takes. Amongst them is Stephen Whittle, Diddy Whittle, a retired academic and a woman who insisted the judgment changed nothing because the law hadn't changed. This is axiomatic, says Helen. Whatever the Supreme Court ruled would by definition become the law as it always was. But misses the point. Since the judgment contradicted trans activist interpretations of the Equality Act, all policies based on that interpretation need to be torn up. In other words, now that we've had the clarification from the Supreme Court, any policy that was based on anything to do with other than there are 2 sexes, male and female, needs to be torn up. Whittle, Stephen Whittle, she'll be running around the halls of academia having conniptions. Good, right? Stage 2, anger, says Helen, spilled off social media into the streets. Trans-identifying men rallied with blue-haired young women, middle-aged virtual signalers of both sexes, and omni-caused protesters taking a break from Just Stop Oil and Free Palestine. It's great, because we were out, when I was out the other day, meeting the Turvan and seeing Aqua Rindolph talk, that self-testes eater, what's his name, Sarah Jane Barker, or whatever it is, was wandering around with his moobs out in Manchester, looking like a comedian's head. These men. Signs waved at a demo in Parliament Square called for the hanging of TERFs and the return of witch burning. It's great, isn't it? I had a mate of mine once who was cooking. He said, I burnt a tart. I thought he was talking about Joan of Arc. One cross-dressing man wanted the world to know that his pussy tastes like non-biological fairy liquid. That's a contortionist right there. 2 others brought a dog in a jacket declaring, I eat TERFs and I'm hungry. A dog in a jacket. These people are insane. A middle-aged cross-dresser with fake boobs spinning out of a baby doll dress explained to a passing videographer that he had used the ladies in Waterloo Station on his way there. I'm not going to stop, he said. If I walked into a men's toilet looking like this, I'm just asking for trouble. That's an interesting one because that's come up before. I've been out and there's been a couple of gusset fumblers there and they got, I'm going to the loo, and I said, go to the males. And can you imagine? They say, what would happen to me if I went in the males? And I said, since when is that a woman's problem? And the gusset fumbler said, I've never thought of it like that before. Interesting, isn't it? Nothing I can say about the violent fetishistic narcissism at the heart of trans activism is half as persuasive as what trans activists say themselves. Every time they speak, they make it harder for all but the most gender-addled politicians to continue insisting that every trans woman is a vulnerable sweetie nobly coping with the tragic, albeit puzzlingly metaphysical disability of having been born looking exactly like a man. having been born looking excited. It's just extraordinary. Just extraordinary. Depression, let alone acceptance, is far away, but the bargaining has started. Victoria MacLeod, that's that other bloke who was a judge, is fundraising with Julian Morn and Whittle. There we go. What's that? That's a Three Stooges. MacLeod, Whittle and Jomo, give me a break, to take a legal challenge on unspecified grounds. Their main beef is that even though MacLeod and Whittle applied to intervene in the Supreme Court, they were refused, and the court didn't hear from trans voices. You know, its job is statutory interpretation, not holding call-ins. Love it. A few MPs are agitating for a change to the law. Good luck. The judgment rested in part on the harm to women's fundamental human rights caused by pretending men can be women, and any change to the law will have to account for that. Dozens of open letters call on the government to do something. What precisely? None make clear. They warn of dire harm to the trans community, making offensive analogies with racial segregation, police entrapment of gay people, and Section 28. It's hard to remember as you read that what's got the signatories, most of them artists and academics. It's the left, artists and academics, so exercised as a court saying men with falsified paperwork don't have the right to enter women's spaces. Again, all to the good. Academics making illogical and legally illiterate arguments are doing more to convince politicians of the need to slash funding for gender studies and the like than anything else. Well said, Helen. That's it. See, I mean, that's Aqua said. Well, you know, in the great conversation she had with Joe Bartosh the other night in Manchester, academia is the higher education sector is screwed, and they need people at the top that are going to go, right, this studies goes, this studies goes, this studies go. We're not funding that. We're not funding that. We're not funding that. And then they need to completely gut every single discipline of all things critical social justice. And there's nobody I can see in the higher education sector that's going to do it. Well, what might be the stages of victory? The first was certainly joy. It carried me through a series of post-judgment interviews in which one person after another asked me, but what about the men? I replied with varying degrees of patience and tact that my primary focus was the female half of humanity, which can now have truly women-owning spaces, and not the petulant and angry men whose unreasonable demands have been humoured for far too long. The joy made some men cross. Alistair Campbell whined to Rory Stewart. I mean, those two, for God, it's like a bloody horror film, isn't it? On a co-host on his Centrist Dad podcast, that despite the judges cautioning that the ruling wasn't a victory for one side after it was handed down, women had the cheek to smile and drink champagne. That gave rise to that great photo with Joe, you know, in the cigar, bit of the Harry Potters. That was what it was, wasn't it? Never mind that the judges said no such thing. They said no group in society was to be prioritised over another. And anyone who has been paying attention will know that's a dig at trans activists, not women. What really delighted me, says Helen, was that this telling off for being mean bitches was illustrated by a picture of me pouring bubbly for Marion Calder of For Women Scotland. This is glorious. On the BBC, an interviewer told me off for failing to express sufficient sympathy for trans-identifying men who now don't know where to pee. Apparently, I don't sound very sorry. I certainly don't. Not when I was still delighted, and certainly not now that I've moved on to the second stage of victory. Rage! Rage at the colossal waste of time and at the obdurate stupidity and nastiness of the other side, at the fruitless attempts to get MPs to listen or to get a hearing on mainstream broadcasters or in the left-wing press. Rage and grief at the stories of women bullied out of work for saying men can't be women and of parents devastated at the harms done by gender doctors for their children. Before the victory, I couldn't allow myself the luxury of that feeling. Go read the rest, right? It's a great article. Helen writes beautifully. Anyway, the 5 stages of victory. Thanks for this, Helen, even though I think Kubler-Ross was a nut job. I'll catch up with you later. You have a great day. Jester out. Bye-bye.